The IMF operates as the central stabilizer of the global financial system, but it functions very differently from an assembly like the UN General Assembly, where every recognized nation receives exactly one vote. Despite having 191 member countries as of 2024, institutional power within the IMF is explicitly engineered to be asymmetric. Out of those 191 nations, only 18 hold more than a 1% share of total influence. The concentration is severe at the absolute peak. The top 6 countries alone command exactly 42% of the total voting power. This extreme asymmetry is not a historical accident or a byproduct of informal political bullying. It is the deliberate, calculated output of a highly specific mathematical equation. The central mechanism driving this institution is called the quota. It is a metric assigned to every country the moment they join the fund. The stated purpose of the quota is straightforward. It is used to calculate and assign a member's relative position and size in the broader global economy. But in practice, this singular numerical value dictates a nation's entire functional relationship with the IMF. In reality, it permanently connects a nation's mandatory capital contributions directly to their political leverage within the institution. To understand the geopolitical power dynamics of global finance, we first have to deconstruct the exact mathematical variables that calculate this quota. The quota performs 4 functions. First, it determines the maximum financial resources a member must provide. Second, it caps the maximum emergency financing a member can obtain. Third, it determines a member's share in allocating SDRs, or special drawing rights. An SDR is an international reserve asset created by the IMF. It is a potential claim on freely usable currencies, supplementing members' official reserves. Fourth, and most consequentially, the quota provides the absolute determination of a member's voting power on IMF decisions. Because a single number dictates both a nation's financial burden and its political authority, the formula used to calculate the quota is one of the most contentious pieces of math in international relations. The current formula was agreed upon in 2008, generating a country's calculated quota share, or CQS. Let's deconstruct the largest variable, Y. This represents gross domestic product and alone accounts for 50% of the total weight. Y is a blended metric. Market exchange rates are weighted at 60%, and purchasing power parity rates, adjusting for cost of living differences, are weighted at 40%. Weighting raw economic output this heavily inherently privileges massive industrialized economies right out of the starting gate. Next is the O variable, representing economic openness, carrying a 30% weight. It's the annual average of a nation's current payments and receipts, tracking goods, services, and income transfers over a 5-year period. This variable specifically rewards nations deeply integrated into cross-border global trade networks. These first 2 variables alone dictate 80% of a nation's quota, mathematically locking in the dominance of wealthy, highly traded nations before the rest of the equation is even run. The third variable accounts for a country's economic vulnerability. V stands for variability, weighted at 15%. It measures the fluctuation of a nation's current receipts and net capital flows, calculated over a 13-year period. The final foundational variable is R for reserves, carrying the smallest weight at just 5%. Reserves are determined by taking a 12-month average of a nation's official foreign exchange holdings and monetary gold. Finally, a modifier is applied to the entire bracketed sum, the compression factor, K. Set at 0.95, it acts as a mathematical brake to slightly compress the final quota shares, marginally reducing the runaway dominance of the absolute largest economies. This completed equation is the objective translator turning raw macroeconomic data into institutional hierarchy. Here is a flowchart of the IMF's governance structure. It shows exactly how the calculated quota output physically manifests as power within the institution. The conversion rate is rigid. A member receives 1 vote per 100,000 special drawing rights of their quota, plus a set of fixed basic votes, identical for everyone. These votes are wielded on the 25-director executive board, which conducts the daily business of the fund and formally oversees lending decisions and conditionalities. This mathematical translation creates a distinct structural malady. The wealthy countries that contribute the most capital naturally hold the most votes. Consequently, the countries who suffer financial crises and need to borrow the most are mathematically guaranteed to have the least voting power when negotiating the strict terms of structural adjustment programs. The Board of Governors can update this math to reflect shifting global economic realities through a process called quota reform. These general reviews are conducted at regular intervals of no more than 5 years. But there is a primary mathematical deadlock holding back sweeping institutional reform within the system, the supermajority rule. Any changes in overall quotas or voting distribution strictly require an 85% majority of the total voting power to pass. Look at this chart of voting distribution to see the current precise vote share of the United States on the executive board, 16.51%. Because the U.S. holds over 15% of the vote, it inherently possesses a unilateral veto over any institutional changes, regardless of what the other 190 nations want. Contrast this with entire regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, whose combined quotas cannot mathematically force or block a resolution on their own. Because of this 85% threshold, structural reform is a rigid, zero-sum negotiation where incumbent powers must willingly vote to dilute their own dominance. This chart shows the entry into effect of general quota increases. We can see the breakthroughs of the 2010 quota reforms and the 16th General Review in 2023. These reviews successfully doubled and then further increased the total pool of quotas, expanding the fund's firepower to roughly $960 billion. This table details the specific percentage point shifts that resulted from these massive reforms. Look at the positive change section at the top. Dynamic emerging markets successfully shifted roughly 6% of quota shares toward themselves. These NATH updates specifically elevated China, establishing it as the third largest member country in the IMF. Now, compare those gains directly to the mathematical losers of the reform in the bottom half of the table. While the incumbent powers lost fractions of a percentage point in the reform, their ultimate veto block remains largely intact. Dynamic emerging markets are slowly forcing the IMF's math to acknowledge their rise, but the underlying architecture ensures that incumbent powers still dictate the speed of global financial evolution.